Papacy, builders of, Gregory I. The Papacy, when Gregory I, a great and also a good pope, was elected to it in 590, had risen to a position far higher than that which it occupied in the time covered by the earlier part of our inquiry. Gregory, who is styled the Great, stands in the foremost rank of popes who have contributed to the exaltation of their see. Those who may be classed with him in this respect are Leo the Great, 440-461, Nicholas I, 858-867, Gregory VII, 1073-1085, and Innocent III, 1198-1216, and to these, if his attempts had been crowned with success, you might add Boniface VIII, 1294-1304, who carried the claims of the papacy higher than any of his predecessors. But Gregory differs from all the rest of them in this respect, that he is the only one of these popes whose memory we can regard with much affection. Whatever the gifts of the others may have been, and although we may make all possible allowance for their sincerity in thinking that the exaltation of the Roman See was the necessary means towards promoting the welfare of the whole Christian Church and the highest interests of mankind, there is yet about them something which, although we may admire them, makes it impossible that we should love them. However pure and unselfish their motives may have been, their conduct looks too much as if it were prompted by a politic and unscrupulous ambition. Gregory I, on the other hand, is a man with whom we feel a sympathy which in the case of the others is impossible. His letters, between 800 and 900 in number, and those passages of his sermons or other writings which bear a reference to his personal circumstances, show him to us in a very favorable light, as a man of truly human feelings, as struggling with great difficulties, as kind, generous, tolerant, while he is zealous for the propagation of the faith, and thoroughly devoted to the cause of the Church. There are, indeed, two special blots on his character, and, although attempts have been made by some writers of more zeal than discretion to wash out these blots, there they remain. I mean, 1. His subservient behavior to the Emperor Phocas, a detestable usurper and tyrant in whom no trace of goodness can be discovered, and, 2. His frequent compliments to the Frankish Queen Berunichilde Brunhilde, who, unless she has been misrepresented more than probability will allow us to suppose, was a very strange object for the praises which Gregory bestows on her. These things, no doubt, are unpleasant to read of, but the right way of treating them, if we wish to deal kindly with Gregory, is not to deny clear historical facts, or to do violence to our own sense of right. 348 Papacy, builders of, Gregory I, and wrong, but to admit that he was not without human weaknesses, that he was an impulsive man, liable to do in haste things of which he might have cause to repent at leisure, liable, in his feeling of zeal for the Church, to forget the duty of looking at all sides of a question, and to welcome such things as seem to be for the Church's immediate advantage, without taking account of all the circumstances which ought to have entered into his consideration. Plain Lectures on the Growth of the Papal Power. James Craigie Robertson, M.A., pp. 115-117, London, Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. In 568, the Lombards under Alboin descended into Italy. They wrested the northern part of the peninsula from the empire. They afterwards got possession of the Duchy of Beneventum, and in Gregory's days they threatened Rome itself. In this state of things, the Pope was necessarily called to take an active part in politics. The Emperor was too far off, and too much engrossed in other affairs, to give any help to his Italian subjects. The exarchs cared for nothing but how to squeeze the highest possible amount of taxes out of the distressed and miserable people. They made no effective opposition to the Lombards. In these circumstances, then, as the pressure of the Lombards made it urgently necessary that something should be done, and as no help was to be expected either from local authorities or from their distant master, the Emperor, the Pope was compelled to act for himself, not only in his spiritual character, but as a great landowner. He did what he could to provide for the defense of the country, and he took it on himself to negotiate a peace with the Lombards, a measure for which he received no better reward from the court of Constantinople than slights and ridicule, but which endeared him to the people whom he had rescued from the miseries of war. Here, then, you see the Pope, as a great landowner, drawn, through the apathy or the helplessness of the imperial authorities, to enter into political engagements, and thus Gregory will be found to have paved the way for the great political influence exercised by his successors, and for the temporal sovereignty which they acquired. Id. pp. 118-120. One thing more there is to be noted as to Gregory, his quarrel with John the Faster, Patriarch of Constantinople, as to the use of the term ecumenical, which John had assumed as part of his style. We have already seen that this title had been sometimes given by Orientals to the bishops of Rome, the first instance having been at the Council of Chalcedon, when it was used by some Alexandrians who wished to recommend themselves to Leo the Great, that it was sometimes also given to the Patriarchs of Constantinople, and that, according to the Eastern usage, it had not that exclusive sense which we might naturally ascribe to it, but that the world was supposed to have room for more than one ecumenical bishop, since the Emperor Justinian gave the title alike to the bishops of Rome and of Constantinople. This, however, the Latins could not or would not understand. They translated the Greek word by universalis, and supposed that ecumenical or universal bishop could not mean anything less than sole and supreme bishop of the whole Church. When, therefore, John of Constantinople styled himself ecumenical, the title was vehemently objected to, first by Pelagius II, Gregory's predecessor, and then by Gregory himself. Gregory declares it to be a proud and foolish word, that the assumption of it was an imitation of the devil, who exalted himself above his papacy, builders of, Nicholas I. 349 fellow angels, that it was unlike the behavior of Street Peter, who, although first of the apostles, did not pretend to be more than of the same class with the rest. This, you will see, is not very consistent with the modern pretensions of the papacy, that it was a token of Antichrist's speedy coming. Id. pp. 124-126. Papacy, builders of, Nicholas I. The second successor of Leo was Nicholas I, who held the see from 858 to 867. The impression which this pope made on those who lived near his own time, yet far enough from it to be able to view him without exaggerating his importance, will appear from the words of Regino, abbot of Priam, who wrote about a century later. In the year of our Lord's incarnation, 868, says Regino, but it was really in May of the year before, the most holy and blessed Pope Nicholas, after many labors for Christ, and many contests for the inviolable state of the Holy Church, departed to the heavenly realms, to receive from the most bountiful Lord a crown of glory that fatteth not away, for the faithful administration of the stewardship committed to him. From the time of Bishop Gregory to our own time, no bishop who has been exalted with pontifical power in the city of Rome, appears worthy to be compared to him. He gave his commands to kings and tyrants, and ruled over them with authority as if he were Lord of the world. To bishops and religious priests who observed the divine commands he appeared humble, mild, piteous, pious, and gentle. To the irreligious and those who strayed from the right path he was terrible, and full of austerity, so that in him another Elias may deservedly be believed to have arisen in our time, God raising him up as another Elias, if not on body, yet in spirit and power. Nicholas may be described as sincerely zealous for the enforcement of discipline in the Church, and is filled with a conscientious sense of the greatness of his position, while he never failed in acting up to his conception of it with resolute firmness, and with great political skill. And circumstances favored his exertions by offering to him opportunities of interfering in the concerns of princes and of churches in such a manner that his actions appeared to be in the interests of justice, and so carried the opinion of mankind with him, while every step which he took was also in effect a step in advance for the papacy. His idea of the rights of his see was such as to lead him to aim at making all secular power subject to the Church, and reducing all national churches into absolute obedience to Rome, and, whether he was fully conscious of this ambitious scheme or not, he labored very powerfully towards realizing it. Id. pp. 169-172. Papacy, builders of, Gregory VII. Hildebrand was the chief representative, the very soul, of a party which had been lately growing up in the Church. He was filled with the loftiest hierarchical ideas. He desired to make the papacy the supreme governing power of the world, not only altogether independent of, but superior to and controlling, all secular power. For these objects Hildebrand was prepared to labor with thorough conviction, with unswerving steadiness, with a far-sighted patience, with a deep, subtle, and even unscrupulous policy. In conversations at Besançon he persuaded Bruno to forego any claim to the papacy which was derived from the emperor's nomination, and to look only to the clergy and people of Rome, whose exclusive privilege it was, according to the views of the hierarchical party, to elect the successors of St. Peter. Bruno laid aside the ensigns of pontifical dignity, and, 350 papacy, builders of, Gregory VII, taking Hildebrand as his companion, proceeded in the guise of a simple pilgrim to Rome, where he declared to the Romans assembled in St. Peter's, that it was for them to confirm or to set aside the choice which had been made of him. He was hailed with loud acclamations as Leo IX, and from that time, under him and his four successors, from 1049 to 1073, Hildebrand was the real director of the papacy. Let us pass on to the pontificate of Hildebrand himself, who was elected in 1073, and assumed the name of Gregory VII. His election was made by the cardinals and approved by the acclamations of the people, according to the decree of Nicholas II, and, agreeably to the same decree, he sent notice to the emperor, and requested him to confirm the choice. This was the last time that the imperial confirmation was sought for an election to the papacy, for Gregory soon carried things far beyond the point at which Nicholas had left them. Gregory's view of the relations of church and state was, that the two powers are irreconcilably hostile to each other, and that the spiritual power is vastly above the secular. In the beginning of his pontificate, indeed, he spoke of the two powers as being like the two eyes in the human body, a comparison which would seem to imply an equality between them. But at a later time he likens them to the sun and the moon respectively, a comparison by which a great superiority is given to the priesthood. The doctrines here announced, in the dictate of Gregory, are far in advance of what we have seen in the forged decretals, both as to the claims which are asserted for the Church against the state, and as to the despotism which they would establish for the papacy over all the rest of the Church. It is laid down that the Roman Pontiff alone is universal bishop. To him alone it belongs to depose or to reconcile bishops, and he may depose them either with or without the concurrence of a synod. He alone is entitled to frame new laws for the Church. He alone may use the insignia of empire. All princes are bound to kiss his feet. He has the right to depose kings or emperors, and to absolve subjects from their allegiance. His power supersedes the diocesan authority of bishops, and from his sentence there is no appeal. All appeals to him must be respected, and to him the greater causes of every church must be referred. No council may be styled general without his command. The Roman Church never has erred, and, as Scripture testifies, never will err. The Pope is above all judgment, and by St. Peter's merits is undoubtedly rendered holy. Such, then, were some of Gregory's principles, and, although they were not so fully realized by him as they were by Innocent III, somewhat more than a century later, it is, Gregory VII, Hildebrand, that must always be regarded as the man from whom, above all others, the papal pretensions derive their greatest development. On the 25th of May, 1085, he breathed his last at Salerno. His latest words are said to have been, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Id. pp. 196-212. When Gregory VII declared that it was sin for the ecclesiastic to receive his benefice under conditions from laymen, and so condemned the whole system of feudal investitures to the clergy, he aimed a deadly blow at all secular authority. Half of the land and wealth of Germany was in the hands of bishops and abbots, who would now be free from the monarch's control to pass under that of the Pope. In such a state of things government itself would be impossible. The Holy Roman Empire. James Bryce, p. 158, London, Macmillan and Co., 1892. Papacy, Builders of, Innocent 111, 351. Gregory VII did not aim at securing the papal monarchy over the Church, that had been established since the days of Nicholas I. He aimed at asserting the freedom of the Church from the worldly influences which benumbed it, by setting up the papacy as a power strong enough to restrain Church and State alike. In ecclesiastical matters Gregory enunciated the infallibility of the Pope, his power of deposing bishops and restoring them at his own will, the necessity of his consent to give universal validity to synodal decrees, his supreme and irresponsible jurisdiction, the precedence of his legates over all bishops. In political matters he asserted that the name of Pope was incomparable with any other, that he alone could use the insignia of empire, that he could depose emperors, that all princes ought to kiss his feet, that he could release from their allegiance the subjects of wicked rulers. Such were the magnificent claims which Gregory VII bequeathed to the medieval papacy, and pointed out the way towards their realization. A History of the Papacy in Creighton, D. Volume I. pp. 17, 18, London, Longmans, Green & Co., 1899, Papacy, Builders of, Innocent III, in 1198, Innocent III, the most powerful of all the popes, was elected at the early age of 37. He was a man of many noble and admirable qualities, but devoted above all things to the aggrandizement of his see, and for this object he labored throughout his pontificate of 18 years with skillful and vigorous exertion. Innocent boldly asserted, in a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople, that to St. Peter had been committed, not only the whole Church, but the whole world. By him that comparison of the spiritual and the secular powers to the sun and moon respectively which I have mentioned in connection with Gregory VII was elaborated and developed more strongly than before. As the moon, he says, borrows from the sun a light which is inferior both in amount and in quantity, so does the regal power borrow from the pontifical. As the light which rules over the day, i.e., over spiritual things, is the greater, and as that which rules over the night, i.e., over carnal things, is the lesser, so is the difference between pontiffs and kings like that between the sun and the moon. Innocent's words on this subject were adopted into the decretals compiled under the authority of Gregory IX, and a commentator, who probably took his measurements from the astronomy of the time, interprets them very precisely as meaning that the Pope is 1744 times more exalted than emperors and all kings. This was certainly no small advance from the original form of Hildebrand's illustration, in which the two powers were likened to the two eyes in the human head, as if they were equal and coordinate with each other. And in accordance with such lofty pretensions Innocent acted, he declared that the empire had been transferred from the Greeks to the Germans by the papal authority, and he claimed for the papacy the right of principally and finally disposing of the imperial crown. Throughout all the other kingdoms of Europe Innocent made himself felt by the vigor and the vigilance of his administration, and not only by asserting the loftiest pretensions of the Roman See, but by enforcing the obligations of Christian morality. This was indeed, as I have already said while speaking of Nicholas I, one of the means which, by enlisting popular feeling on his side, as the cause of right and justice, by teaching men to regard the Pope as the vindicator of innocence against oppression, tended most powerfully to facilitate the advance of the Roman Pontiff to that position of supreme arbiter and 352 Papacy, Ig tel LDKKS of, in MXGM 111. Controller which he now attained among the kingdoms of Western Christendom. In whatever direction we may look, we see Innocent interfering with a high hand, and claiming for his office the right of giving laws to sovereigns. In France, Philip Augustus, by putting away his wife Ingeborga, a Danish princess, and entering into an irregular marriage with Agnes of Maranea, gave the Pope a pretext for intervention. An interdict was pronounced on the whole kingdom, and, although Philip for a time endeavored to resist the sentence, and to evade his obligations, the terrors of this sentence were so severely felt that he found himself compelled to yield to the general voice of his subjects, and to submit to the Pope's commands by doing a tardy justice to Ingeborga. Still more remarkable was Innocent's triumph as to England, where, taking advantage of the contemptible character of the sovereign, John, he forced his nominee, Stephen Langton, into the primacy, in disregard of the rights of the national church and of the crown, and brought the king to submit to resign his crowns into the hands of a legate, and to hold the kingdoms of England and Ireland on condition of paying a heavy annual tribute to the papacy. In the East, the pontificate of Innocent was marked by an important event. A crusading force, which had been gathered for the Holy War of Palestine, allowed itself to be diverted to Constantinople, where it restored a dispossessed emperor to his throne, and afterwards, when this emperor and his son had been again dethroned by a kinsman, when the younger prince had been murdered, and the father had died of grief, the Crusaders put down the usurper, and established the Latin sovereignty in the capital of the Eastern Empire. The Pope had at first vehemently denounced the change of purpose from a war against the infidels to an attack on a Christian state, but the brilliant success of the expedition reconciled him to the irregularity, and he sanctioned the establishment of a Latin empire at Constantinople, with a Latin patriarch and clergy intruded to the exclusion of the hated native hierarchy of Greece. In the south of France, this pontificate was disgraced by the beginning of the war carried on with singular atrocity against the Albigensian heretics, which ended in the establishment of orthodoxy by the slaughter of multitudes, and in the desolation of the rich and flourishing country. It was in this war that the famous Spanish monk Dominic first became conspicuous, and to Innocent is to be referred the sanction of the two great mendicant orders, the Preaching Friars, founded by Dominic, and the Minorites, founded by Francis of Assisi. These orders enjoy the especial favor of the papacy, and, from the manner in which they penetrated, as none had before done, to the humblest classes of society, in them the papacy found its most active and most serviceable agents. On the whole, it may be said that Innocent was the greatest and the most successful of popes. In him the power of the Roman See attained its height, and his successors, by endeavoring to carry it still higher, provoked a reaction which was disastrous to it. Plain Lectures on the Growth of the Papal Power, James Gray G. Robertson, M.A., pp. 233-240, London, Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. It was reserved, however, for Innocent III to realize most fully the ideas of Hildebrand. If Hildebrand was the Julius, Innocent was the Augustus, of the Papal Empire. He had not the creative genius nor the fiery energy of his great forerunner, but his clear intellect never missed an opportunity, and his calculating spirit rarely erred from its mark. A man of severe and lofty character, which inspired universal respect, he possessed all the qualities of an astute political intriguer. Papacy, builders of, Boniface 353. He was lucky in his opportunities, as he had no formidable antagonist. Among the rulers of Europe his was the mastermind. In every land he made the papal power decisively felt. In Germany, France, and England, he dictated the conduct of the kings. A History of the Papacy in Creighton, D. Volume I, p. 21, London, Longmans, Green & Co., 1899. The first step in Innocent's plan was to make himself the political head of Europe. In Italy he first made himself absolute sovereign of Rome by removing all vestiges of imperial rule. The senators and the prefect, who held their commissions from the emperor, were required to take oaths to him as their sovereign. The imperial judges were also replaced by his own appointees. By persuasion or tactful diplomacy he gained the mastery over the warring Roman nobles. From Rome he gradually extended his sway over the rest of Italy. He was made regent of Frederick II, the youthful son of Henry V, now king of Sicily. He forced the Tuscan cities to recognize his suzerainty instead of that of the German emperor, and subdued the March of Ancona and the Duchy of Spoleto. He posed as the champion of Italian independence and liberty against foreign rule. His leadership was generally recognized and he was called the father of his country. Innocent III was the first pope who claimed and exercised the rights of an Italian prince. When Emperor Otto IV ceded all the lands claimed by the papacy under grants from former rulers, an indisputable title to the papal states was established. The Rise of the Medieval Church, Alexander Clarence Flick, Ph.D., Lit. D. pp. 549, 550. New York, G. P. Putnam's Sons. No other wearer of the papal tiara has left behind him so many results pregnant with good and ill for the future of the Church. Under him, Innocent III, the papacy reached the culmination of its secular power and prerogatives. The principles of sacerdotal government were fully and intelligently elaborated. The code of ecclesiastical law was completed and enforced. All the Christian princes of Europe were brought to recognize the overlordship of the successor of St. Peter. All the clergy obeyed his will as the one supreme law. Heresy was washed out in blood. The pseudo was the Dorian decretals and the dreams of Hildebrand had been realized. Yet in this very greatness, wealth, and strength, were the germs of weakness and disease which were eventually to overthrow the great structure reared by Innocent III and his predecessors. Id. pp. 566, 567, Papacy, Builders of, Boniface VIII, his quarrel with Philip the Fair of France. The conflict began in 1296, when the Pope issued a bull, known from its initial words as Claricis Licos, which pronounced the ban on all princes and nobles who under any pretext imposed tallages on the church and clergy. Although the bull did not mention Philip by name, it was clearly aimed at him, the Pope's object being to induce Philip by fear of wanting supplies to refer his dispute with the English King Edward I to himself for decision. In this object he failed at the time. Having entirely misjudged the character of his opponent, Philip retaliated by prohibiting the exportation of gold and silver out of France, thus depriving Boniface of an important portion of his revenue.